Canada is moving ahead today in the investigation into the Flight 752 disaster. The federal government is demanding a significant role in the probe. And today, the Canadian investigation moves into Iran. The full team will be there for the first time since Iran admitted the Ukraine International Airlines passenger jet was shot down by an Iranian anti-aircraft missile. Now, these are images from Ukraine's investigation team that show the holes in the jet's fuselage. 57 Canadians and 81 others were flying to Canada, and they are among those killed when the jet crashed in flames last week. The Transportation Safety Board says another team with specific expertise in black box data will also be part of the Canadian investigation. Chris Brown has the latest in the capital of Ukraine. He's talking to the top investigator in that country and also has more on the latest on the Canadian role in the probe.
Well, Heather, they call this the Standing Rapid Deployment Team. This is sort of a first out the door, let's establish a beachhead group. We understand that there are 3 members of the Transportation Safety Board that are part of that, and those 3 members, or at least 3 members of that team, have been able to get in. They arrived over the weekend, but as of today, 8 more members are flying in, and then the final member will come tomorrow. Specifically what they're going to be doing, we actually haven't been given a blow-by-blow, but talking to the Ukrainians, we know that there are a number of huge, difficult, very painful tasks ahead. One is simply identifying the bodies that are still there. We understand only about 30% or so have been identified, so the Canadians will no doubt be helping with that. And then dealing with the repatriation of these bodies as well, and of course the actual physical crash site, looking over all the parts, trying to understand exactly what happened in the final moments of that plane's flight. Ukraine has the largest foreign contingency of investigators there. Some 45 members left Kyiv almost immediately, but of course Canada does not have diplomatic representation in Iran. It was much harder, much more logistically difficult to get them there. Ukraine has a jet, Hercules, I think it is, maybe not a Hercules, but it has a jet there anyway. And the idea is that when the body identification is complete, when the bodies can be returned, they may in fact come through Ukraine on their final journey home. Heather.
So, as is clear, Chris, I mean, this part of the investigation just beginning, and there are so many questions remain about what happened, even though we had the admission, stunning as it was, from Iran over the weekend, that it was, in fact, a missile that shot down this passenger jet. Now, you've been speaking, as I mentioned, with the top investigator, the head of the Ukrainian investigation, his name is Alexei Danilov, and I know in speaking to him, it was a one-on-one conversation. Some interesting moments occurred during that interview, but what did you find out from him overall?
Well, you mentioned the interesting moment. I mean, the president of Ukraine called him right in the middle of our interview, and he stood up and walked over and he took a phone call. And the topic was, in fact, the status of these Canadian investigators, when were they going to be arriving and so forth. We were asked not to report the contents of that conversation, so that's all I'm going to say about it for now. But Canada was certainly talked about. But yes, Alexei Danilov is the guy in charge. He's spearheading all of the efforts that Ukraine has put into this. He told us a couple of key things. I'll just recap. One, they believe that the missile, at least one missile, hit right below the cockpit. That immediately killed the crew. They were able to tell that by looking at the cockpit, looking at the fuselage as well. They also said that they actually learned that very early on in the investigation, really just 3.5 hours into their work on the ground. But they didn't say anything about it because they didn't want to anger Iran. They wanted to keep good relations, wanted to keep things moving, at least as far as their crash investigators. He also talked about the very difficult job of identifying the bodies.
Ну, по-перше, кожна країна своїх громадян забирає самостійно. Зараз триває процедура ідентифікації.
He told us that Iran has 50 experts that are involved in this DNA process. All of them have been brought into Tehran. They're all gathered there, and they're all working on this case. He said until the final analysis is complete, countries will not be able to take home the bodies of their citizens. So, as I say, a very difficult, very painful job. He did mention only 30% of the human remains have been positively identified. You know, just talking to him, he's a guy who hadn't had sleep really for a good 4 days. He said his investigators on the ground were going without sleep as well. Some of them only slept for 2.5 hours. So very, very difficult conditions for everyone who's involved in that investigation in Iran. Heather.
Chris Brown with the very latest from inside Ukraine. Larry Vance joins us, former pilot. He has over 3 decades of experience in aircraft accident investigation, and you know him as a former investigator with the Transportation Safety Board of Canada. He's in Ottawa this morning. And Mr. Vance, I'm delighted to have you on the program this morning. Thank you.
Good to be with you, Heather.
Let me ask you, first of all, I mean, we know now what brought down the plane. It was shot down by a missile accidentally. So if we know that, and I'm not trying to be flip or anything at all on that point, but what else is there to investigate?
Well, there's lots to do, Heather. The Transportation Safety Board individuals will be there on behalf of Canadians and on behalf of the families to start filling in the holes, to start putting the sequence of events together. That's very, very important for, even though we know what happened, we have to put the historical sequence of events in place so that it lasts forever. And that's what they're up to.
So things like, was it one missile or two? Why was it allowed to fly at all at that time on a war footing? Why was the commercial airspace not closed? Those kinds of additional questions?
Exactly, those kind of things. They're going to be busy. They'll get briefed in first by the Iranians. They'll get briefed in by the Ukrainians who have been there for quite some time. Then they'll want to see things like the wreckage. They want to go see the wreckage for themselves. They want to take their own photos. They want to examine the wreckage to look for the penetration points from the shrapnel from the missile that hit the aircraft. They want to try and determine if there was one missile or 2 missiles. They have lots to do.
So we understand from Ukrainian officials, they told us, CBC, that wreckage is now in a hangar near the crash site, so they will want access to that. Is there anything for the TSB team to do on the crash site itself?
Oh, they'll go there. They'll take some pictures. But as we understand it, the crash site has now been disturbed and it doesn't look anything like what it did before.
Right.
They'll want to draw up the exact track line for the airplane. They'll want to know where the missiles were fired from. They'll want to know where the aircraft was exactly when it hit, and they want to know where it was when it struck the ground. They want to draw that profile up.
So we know what brought it down, but obviously there's still many more things that we need to know in order to have the full picture. And we heard from the Prime Minister yesterday at that vigil in Edmonton saying Canada will not rest until there are answers. There are many more answers to get. Some more of those answers coming from that second TSB team that we're learning of, a team with expertise in analyzing black box data. What would their work involve, Mr. Vance?
Well, they're going to go to wherever the black boxes are going to be read. The word is that they're going to France. They'll arrive in France and they'll participate in the downloading of the information. And then when they get the data off the data recorders, they'll be part of the team that will analyze it. I would imagine that what they will see is that the black boxes stopped almost instantaneously when the missile struck the airplane. Now, that might not be true. The black boxes are way back in the tail of the airplane, and if they still had power to them, then they may show some of the flight profile of the wreckage as it descended from 8,000 feet down to the surface.
Okay. We had reporting over the weekend that the missile detonated outside very near the cockpit, so that would explain perhaps that sudden stoppage very close to the time of detonation.
Right, but the actual physical location of the recorders is in the tail of the aircraft, so if they still have power.
I'm sorry for that. You know what? This is why I turned to you. My apologies. I didn't realize that.
Right.
So,
however, you have to remember that the black boxes receive a lot of the data that they actually record from the front end of the airplane. So it's quite possible that they will have just stopped instantaneously when the missile hit near the cockpit.
Okay. It's interesting. I hadn't heard that. I was going to ask you, would they get access if the black boxes are in Iran? I hadn't heard. There was some discussion that if Iran didn't have the technical expertise to analyze the boxes properly, they might be sent to France, maybe to Canada. But you're hearing that it could go to France and Canadians could have access to the data there.
Well, that's what I'm hearing now. Hey, anything can happen. This is a pretty fluid situation. So, but I don't think that they would have the capability of downloading them and analyzing them right in Iran.
There are other Canadian responders who are expected to arrive in Tehran today. The team that will have responsibility for things like body identification and repatriation. Would the TSB team have any role in that part of the Canadian response?
It would be a limited role. No, that's the responsibility of, if it were here in Canada, that would be the coroner's office and the police services. So the TSB would help wherever they could, the TSB folks, but they would be more concentrating on getting this sequence of events down and gathering all the information to have historical data. One of the other things that's happening here is the TSB wants to go there to make sure that they get all the information so that later on they have that information to train people. They're looking for accident prevention. The TSB folks are in the business of accident prevention.
Yes.
They want to gather up this information and say, hey, if somehow this is one element of it. Somehow later on an aircraft disappears. Here's what you look for historically. This is what they found in Iran, where they know a missile hit the airplane. Here's some good training opportunity, and let's put that into the record. Let's make sure that we can say later on to investigators, here's what you look for, here's what happened to this airplane. Like there'll be little holes in this airplane, for example. They're penetration holes from the outside in near the cockpit. And what do they look like exactly? What do you look for? That kind of thing.
So a learning experience for the future, if ever something as horrific as this should arise. I'm wondering, I've been listening to your comments. In the early days, of course, so much of the questioning over what caused this plane to come down. And then we learned suddenly and rather remarkably over the weekend when Iran made that admission that one of its missiles erroneously brought down the plane. I'm wondering, in terms of thinking of the families, I mean, how much time and agony did that admission save them?
Oh. Well, that admission is key to it all. I don't think that the Iranians had any choice but to make that admission. The evidence was overwhelming, not just from the flight profile and from the radar data that was coming out. It was all publicly available, and then they knew that the Ukrainians had the goods on them. They knew they had photos of the wreckage showed penetration from a missile, so they really had no choice but to fess up. I mean, it was they were going to be blamed anyway, and the evidence was there to prove it. So good on them to finally fess up. Now we'll see what level of cooperation they give to the rest of this event.
And for the many questions that you made clear are still outstanding. Larry Vance, as always, we appreciate your time and expertise. Thank you.
Good talking to you, Heather.